freaking let's go into a magic class regarding the Nimzo Indian defense and the attack on the king side. Say again, freaking the Nimzo Indian defense, the attack on the king side. This is the position that we started with. Pawn to d4, pawn to b6, pawn to e4. Engine calls it a slight inaccuracy, but it doesn't really preferably make a difference at the highest GM level. To ending up as me white, and then let's say and ending up here and starting off with this. I immediately go with a let me grab my notes so I can keep myself on track. Before we start this game, this is a game that called holy my goodness. This game features a complex struggle from a start of all event structure and transition to a dynamic middle game. I determine a perfect understanding of central space and kingside pressure, ultimately capitalizing on black's weakened pawn structures on g6 and h6. An exposed king. This analysis focuses on the transition to the opening to the clinical endgame conversion. Let's go by move by move technical analysis. The categories are going to be move, category, the Y, strategic intent, and the end evaluation estimate, and alternative/improvement. So, immediately let's see. Freaking d4 to b6. Very simple. Always defense channel in the center from the flank. +4 is advantage because of the opening uncontested center. Go for e4, another book move. e6, preparing d4 like this. 0.5 advantage. Now this knight f6 would be more active technically from a computer standpoint. Alright, then I go knight to c3, guarding the light square pawn that's put in the center. My opponent goes immediately go bishop to b4. Simply starting its development, and I already know there's two potential long-term structural weaknesses I want to focus on: the f pawn, the c pawn, and the a pawn, if I'm correct. So as you immediately see, bishop b3, completing what was it called? Bishop to d3, completing a double fianchetto channel bishop on, as immediately putting pressure on my knight. Also +5. It's like a so here, I mean to go bishop d3, simply defending my center pawn, e pawn in the center. Immediately completes the first Iron Triangle setup on b7 to get long-term scope on the freaking light squares that are diagonally h5 diagonally. And it's me to go knight to e2, developing increasing pressure on the e4 pawn, and my opponent immediately goes with knight to f6. Is a Dutch-like defense, not the third pawn in the center, which was usually going to be. This would be usually the main Dutch defense in this type of pawn structure, but my opponent chose not to do that. So I immediately go a3, resolving the tension, gaining the bishop pair for myself. So trade takes. I get the bishop pair with one knight on a great output on a pretty good central square, and it resolves the tension. Bishop with e7 would have been way too passive in that situation. Now, as you obviously saw, knight to c3 was powerful epics, preventing the g5 pin, but also creates a hook for the attack. A hook pawn, +9, d6 or castles would have been more solid. So immediately, I go pawn to e5, my opponent goes knight to d5, so I strike the knight and take more space in the center. My knight takes an outpost, offering a trade of knights. And I'm forcing knight to move and opening. Also, what's it called? The good square bit of the freaking, because both bishops are technically what they're formed that are good bishops, theoretically, because they're behind the pawn chain of these freaking squares, so they're just raising pressure down like this. I'm not sure why the engine always wanted to go here. I'm assuming it wanted to punish these structural weaknesses and put pressure here, but with also those same support to the bishops. I didn't really get that idea until about 2 moves later. Also, castling is strong too, but the center is locked, so I take my time while castling. So I trade off my knight and have the bishop pair. Bishop takes, and I have a bishop and knight versus the bishop pair with queen and rook. Only one pawn push, which I'm very conservative, and I would say knight to d5 and bishop d5 take. I simplify the center. Now black's bishop is very active, but it gives me a good target, and I could have won queen to g4 immediately to punish on black's sort of pawn structure over here. These slow, sort of backwards pawns, like formation. And simply, I immediately go queen to g4 and attack and move, forcing a weakness on the dark squares f6 or h6, and it keeps and then also king to f8 would keep all the pawns intact, because this move is basically just saying, hey, I wanted to force a weakness that I can put pressure on with these closed pawn chains. Because even though he has a knight that's good in this closed position, this knight is not developed, so I don't see it as a threat as a current immediate place. So immediately goes g6, forcing a weakness that I can punish on, which is now this square. Because these pawns guard these two squares, this pawn guards this square, so this square is a weakness right here. You just simply castle. Powerful up is connecting the rook, connecting the rooks. And then my opponent goes queen d7, slowly trying to prepare for a queenside castle, making the objective point very valuable to throw a pawn storm against my king, with my queens and bishops defending. And my job is to simply continue to put more pressure on the king side and to stop counterplaying the queen side. So immediately I go bishop b4. A skates game, very simply just saying, hey, you're not going to be allowed to strike with this, nor going to be allowed to overextend this pawn, because this rook's always defending this A file, sort of an X-ray, putting pressure on the pawn and the rook. Then immediately goes bishop to b7, simply restricting, as I said, restricting black's queenside expansion, because I only see two options, a pawn storm and counterplay on the queen side. So I slowly try to set down one option at a time. As you saw, immediately went for king safety, bishop b2 and castles, and let's get big trash. My opponent immediately goes, where am I at? What move am I at? Move 13. So pawn, as you see before, I went pawn to c. I went pawn to c3 because we have opposite color bishops. So I put all my pawns on the light square, even on dark squares. But even though I have a backwards pawn now, I'm willing to make the argument that simply your light square bishop is not going to be able to target this this backwards pawn, because your queen and light square bishop is on dark. Your queen may be on dark squares, but it's only one piece. What else can it do when all the pawns are connected in a very good like structure, controlling all these squares? It's pretty challenging because the queen's not gonna be able to just run in this territory like this and get and attack on the flank pawns without getting captured. So that's why I did my move to c3. My opponent goes knight to c6, clearly continuously preparation of queenside castling, originally signaled a race to attack. And even me, I could have even simply just pushed the pawn immediately. The engine one did it to simply continue to try and start an attack and damage black's pawn structure. However, I was playing for a long-term positional game. I didn't feel like immediately going for a throw, which it was in my mind, but I didn't see any reason for it, because I always like to say it like this: the rooks and the knights are the best pieces to support pawn thrust with. Pawn thrust, because the rook and knight and a long-term piece, you could literally use a king and knight and use a very powerful pawn thrust to change the game. Same thing with a rook. This is why I stopped. This is the best engine move in this position. As I turn on the engine now, this doesn't have about a point 0.2 advantage, which in engine play that would be decisive. In human play, it wouldn't be decisive depending on the level, but it would be something that's very hard to lose unless you completely mess up. So I go bishop b2, and I'm simply just trying to get long-term pressure on this rook here, because I know my king is going to, I know the king's in the castle here, so I'm gonna want to simply put long-term pressure on this rook. I'm not going immediately for the best engine line because I don't see it necessary at the time. And I'm making the argument that even though my bishops are passive, later in this game it's going to get a beautiful scope on the side of the board. So I'm going to make a trade-off now for it to be passive, but later when these pawns get up and I trade off the light square bishop or go more into endgame, this is going to make a major difference. So immediately queenside castle, I go rook f to e1, immediately just supporting the pawn, simply going for a rook lift. What's it called? Here, potentially here, to continue to punish his black weaknesses and continue to put pressure with a simple rook lift. This idea is still always available. Moving the king, and as you see, the moved freaking black move 15 moves the king off a semi-open file on the c file and moves to defend the bishop and the knight and all pawns, and shows that it's in a very defensive position. Go rook to e3, tactical strike, trying to gain counterplay, creating a pass pawn. And then immediately he goes pawn to f5, trying to get counterplay. I immediately catch a en passant, shut down the counterplay from black. Pawn takes 6. Queen does not want to trade Why does the queen not want to trade in this situation? Is because it's two bishops against bishop and knight and two rooks where it's an active king and very good pawn structure. If the queens are off the board, then the queen cannot really cause any more further structural weaknesses. So let's say if black were to take, hold on, holy lord. Even though there's not a set advantage now, just this position is way harder to defend without a queen, to my understanding. But let us continue. Of course, black did not take that trade. Here, black declines the trade and goes to, as you saw, the capture of e adds f6, queen takes f6, opening lines for the heavy pieces, and also knight f6 was playable too. And when I capture this pawn, winning a pawn, in the long term, black's pieces is allowed to coordinate, but I understand the reason why. And I allow black's pieces to coordinate because I trust and I'm confident enough in myself that as I'm a pawn up, it's going to make a difference in the endgame. I can trust playing in a good and high enough level to deal with black's coordination. Queen to e7. I could have did rook to f3, immediately putting pressure on this open file here with the rook lift, but I chose not to. So immediately went d5, central strike. I exploit the pin on the c file. As you see, the pawn on the c file, as this pawn is protected. No, wait, what the hell is this? No, exploiting the pin on the c file, and I'm hitting, and also I'm though attacking the knight and the pawn. Then let's go rook to g8. Immediately attacking my queen. Go queen to h5, continually defense of my pawn. Rook to g5. I dodge rook to h3, so black is gaining a lot of time and good forcing moves, and my opponent immediately goes knight to d8. I don't really understand the reason why for this. I see that there's an opportunity to punish because black got a lot of tempi and time, so I see you're gonna waste your time and find a way to punish it. So I take some time to think, and I immediately go f4. f4 was an aggressive push. I dislodged the rook, and I weakened the king's cover. However, I needed to immediately get some pressure and stop black's coordination, so that's why I made an argument of trading off the f-pawn, which could be punished in higher level play. And also to say c4 was more precise, to be more patient. And it better was and to do a discover attack on this rook right here, rook this bishop to c4. I did this move order at a different time, which was more forcing. I just did this in a different order. So black immediately takes and gets the pawn back for free, and I get a double attack from attacking both rooks. So I know one of these rooks are going to fall. c4, and then rook takes d3. I move, and I basically force rook to d4, and I trade off a pair of rooks. And now the rook has to move out the way because I did that pull purposely to gain one rook. And even though I'm friggin' how do I think of this? Even though I'm up a rook and I'm 2 pawns, I have a rook and 2 pawns. Immediately went rook to g3 and then rook to g8. Immediately continuing to try to trade off the liquefied position and get the rooks off the board. My opponent immediately goes queen to f8. I still take the rook anyways because I want to completely transition this to an endgame as soon as possible because I have this. There's this one weakness right freaking here. The freaking h pawn that I'm gonna take advantage of and eventually get past. So this is why I offer a queen trade. And simply queen to g3 is also an improving move, keeping the queen active, eyeing on the c2 square, and then queen to h7, and then immediately slowly go h3. Infiltrating, I'm attacking. I'm simply just attacking what's it called. I'm simply making an advance on my pawn, making my opponent very clear that this is my game-winning strategy with this pass pawn on the h file, and then infiltration, attacking the bishop on b2 and c3. Bishop b5 is slightly better, and simply invading where I knew eventually I'm freaking what's it called black wanted to do. I just didn't know when. So I immediately move my bishop to f6. I attack the knight, defending the long diagonal. Knight to c6, go c5, going for a pawn break, takes, king check, and in that sequence of mind, I wanted to put my king here because it's on the opposite color of this light square bishop, so it wouldn't be able to be harassed as much. So queen g8 was interpositive check, the forced check, and there was no other legal move. Bishop to wait, as you see in the capture, and now I go king to h2, his attacking move. And simply, black punishes that by putting queen to f5, forking f4, and bishop f6. Queen f2 would be even more annoying. However, I use rook to f1 to x-ray and defend both of my pieces, saying if you're going to take one piece, I'm going to defend another. And then simply goes king to b7, improving the king's position slightly. Immediately go queen to h8, defending everything, the bishop, the pawn. The king defends both g and h pawn. Immediately, black goes freaking h5, freezing the pawn and freezing the h5, and simply trying to freeze the king side, which will continue to be exploited soon enough. Immediately goes king to b6, a risky maneuver in the center of the board. Why? Because I still have major pieces that are going to harass this king. This king should have waited later into actually going for a king walk and supporting its pawns and getting more active. However, black chose not to do that. Look at black's development, and king decided to go on the king walk. It doesn't make any sense. You're just asking to get checked. So, rook to b2. The king is being learned. I slowly try to learn into a mating net. If it's king a5, let's call it, it loses to queen c3 check. So, immediately he goes opposite direction. King to c5. Bishop h4. Continue trying to reroute the bishop to harass the king. And my opponent plays bishop a6. Probably bringing the light square bishop out. Not a really active square. You go queen check. Queen to cg check. Trying to shoot in a position move and block the bishop. You go bishop f2. Force move, retreating the king, but the damage is done. And then queen takes e4 wins the game because I'm up a minor piece. And then endgame with a rook and a bishop and 2 pawns and have a potential outside h pawn. King e7. Immediately go check. Freaking bishop h4 attacking move, driving the king to the edge of the board plus 15. Then rook b king f7. Immediately go rook b7, open that position for white's clean, and makes d5. And just simply saying, I'm gonna just say absolutely screw my pawn structure. You're gonna hang a knight, and you're gonna just lose everything. So you take the knight, king g4 check. I block with my bishop. Queen retreats. I trade off. Get a double pawns on the c file. Isolated pawn on the freaking. And then simply a desperado, and queen c6 and queen f4 the final check. But now bishop g3 ends all those threats. As you saw on the defense, forcing a queen chain into a lost endgame. Queen c4 would have been the simplest path. And then exchange. The winning endgame is technically winning for white. Mate in 7, estimately. Then rook to c7, king to f6. Rook takes pawn. Rook puts pawn. Bishop h4 check. King e5. And this is where I simply just make a simple formation of the rook and the bishop and the king. To constantly, firstly, I don't immediately promote my pawn because I want to put my bishop guarding the promotion square in the a file before I go and get any sort of hope and counterplay, because I'm playing against Master Lily Stockfish now because black resigned after that queen trade. So king to c6, h4, a6, h5, king to b5, h6, c4, h7, a5, queen to h8, h8 pawn h8 equals queen. King to d3, bishop b2, making a mating net, e5, takes, push pawn, check, move out the way, check again with the rook, c5 check, king b1, rook c1 check, king a2, bishop to a1, king to b3, queen b4, and then queen to b2 checkmate. As you can see, I only made 2 inaccuracies in this game, and I'm choosing accuracy. My opponent had 92% accuracy, made 1 blunder in the end, and it cost him. So I hope you guys learned something new. I'm going to end up with this outro and talk about, and then we'll say this. The turning point in this game was the kingside structural compromise. I moved g6 by forcing black to create hooks. I created a long-term strategic advantage that was converted through relentless attack and unexposed pain. Even when black attempted to complicate the game with f5, I made king composure simplified to a winning material advantage. I executed a king hunt with surgical precision. Now let's talk about the evolution of central control. The history of chess strategy is navigating shifting paradigms regarding the center. For centuries, classical schools dictated that the center must be occupied by pawns. In the early 20th century, you see the revolution is shaped by hypermodernism, which suggested the center can be controlled by distance using pieces. Understanding the tension is vital for any high-level player to master complex pawn structures. Let's talk about the classical era. Classical school championed by Will Stein and the first world chess champion Suga Tarshkasai treated the center like a physical territory. Pawn occupation. A player must put the pawn at e4, d4, e5, and d5. Pawns in the center restrict the opponent's piece and provide anchors for your own knights. In the Tarshkasai dogma, Tarshkasai famously claimed he who holds the center holds the game. To him, a cramped position was a lost position. Classical pawn structures, the bin center. E4 and D4, total dominance projecting a kingside or central breakthrough. If maintained, vulnerable to chipping and undermined. Strong if maintained, and also it's vulnerable to being chipped or undermined. And then the fixed center, where pawns are locked, center D5, leaving to maneuvering, favoring to the side that has better minor piece coordination. The hypermodern revolution was this: control versus occupation. In the 1920s, a new generation of managers, Arnold Nurtswitch, Richard A. Riddy, and Gawa Bruver, shattered the classical consensus. They argued that a master pawn center was not an asset but a target. Pressure from the flanks instead of occupying the centers. Hypermoderns using fianchetto bishops on G2 or B2 to exert long-range pressure. The center is the target. They allowed the opponent to build a big center to only systematically undermine it with C5, F5, and E5. The goal was to entice the pawns forward until they became overextended and weak. So this is relying on the fact that our opponents would over-push our central pawns in big center. Think about that. Now the hypermodern pawn structures. The Pirks and King's Indian. Giving up the center early to strike back with E5 and C5 later. High risk, high reward, required precise timing. The Hedgehog. The crutching setup. A6, B6, D6, E6. Waiting for a thematic brace. Extreme resilience and punishes over-aggression. And comparing the schools, a pawn center is like a beautiful house. It's wonderful to live in, but also can be burned down. Arnold Nimzowitsch. The feature is this: center strategy, occupy pawns with the E4, D4, hypermagical control with pieces, bishop G2, bishop B2, knight F3, deal piece. Knight on a central outpost of E5, bishop on a long diagonal H1 and A8. Weaknesses: can be a target for pawn breaks, can lead to lack of space and counterplay fails. Famous openings: the Willie Opens, the Game Seen It, famous opening for the Hypermodern School, Nimzo Indian, Ready Opening, Grinfield. The modern synthesis is today, Grandmasters do not choose any other over. They use both. They find a modesty between them. A modern player might play a classical opening under Queen's Gambit, but defend it with hypermodern principles of piece activity and pressure. Pawn structure dynamics. Tension. The modern game revolves around maintaining central tension, keeping the option to capture or push, forcing the opponent to commit first. Also, simply a queen isolated pawn, a classical structure where one pawn has a pawn on d4 with no neighboring pawns. Provides attacking lanes, classically, a long-term endgame weakness, hypermodern 2. The battle between classical and hypermodern schools taught us that space is relative. A pawn center is only strong if it can be defended. If it can be pressured by pieces from the flank, it becomes a liability. Your goal as a high-level student is to recognize to plant the flag with pawns and when to snipe from corners. Or when to plant the flag on the Imajima and to have reinforcements standing by, or when to simply go on a classified option, classic radio silent, and complete silence of an operation. So, hope you guys enjoy. Learn something new, and goodbye.